Right, we've just ticked past the past and we've got plenty of ground to cover, so we'll get going. So welcome everyone, welcome to our speakers and the panelists. Thank you very much for joining, and also our audience. So today we're continuing the debate on the future of the workplace for professional services firms in an uncertain world. A world where there's seamlessly endless possibilities and even higher expectations than we've ever seen before. So I'm Anna Jarrold, I'm a tax partner and lead the professional services tax team for BDO. I've got many years of experience in advising professional service firms and broadening into areas much further beyond tax, and the subject for today is fascinating to watch play out. For those who don't know, BDO is a global accounting network operating in more than 160 countries, over 90,000 people and 10 billion US dollars in turnover. The professional services sector is an area of focus for BDO. And in the UK, we've got more than 25 partners regularly advising professional services firms, with many more adding their expertise when called upon. This session is the third of the series that BDO have hosted on rethinking how professional services firms can best utilise their workplace. Whilst thinking on the use of the workplace has definitely evolved since the start of the pandemic, we're still right in the middle of what can only be really seen as a huge social experiment. Daily media headlines continue covering things like the Great Resignation, the culture of an organisation, and the importance of mental health and well-being of all of our people. So professional services firms are taking the opportunity to redefine property strategies and reevaluate flexible working practices, or they're actually being forced to. Firms are looking to make the best, most often high-cost investments and long-term decisions that can have a fundamental impact on their people and therefore the future of their firms. So are these decisions being based on foundations made of quicksand, or is there some evidence that we can draw on? So it's a really complex topic, fast-changing environment, and we've got many perspectives, and one size is unlikely to fit all. So can I ask you to get involved in the conversation today? Please use the Q&A function on your screen to pose questions. I will try and pick those up with our panelists as we go along. So let me welcome our expert panelists. We've got Judith Mooring, a clinical psychiatrist and wellbeing expert. Judith has been working with individuals and organisations throughout the whole of the pandemic and will approach this discussion from a health and wellbeing perspective. We've got Carlos Posada, an advisor to professional services firms on the design of their workplaces. Carlos is principal and legal leader at Gensler and will share his client experiences with us. Paul Eagland is BDO's managing partner in the UK, and Paul will share his personal experiences of leading BDO into hybrid working and the investment decision-making he's been through. And we also have Matt Oakley. Matt's head of commercial property research for UK and Europe at Savills UK. And Matt will share his research on property occupancy rates and factors influencing office occupancy. So the format for today is that each of our panelists will kick us off with their perspective, and then we'll move into the panel discussions. So Judith, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your kind words, and thank you to all of you, wherever you are, whether you're at home or in the office this morning, for your attention. Everybody's time is very precious, so I hope this is a valuable experience. I am a consultant psychiatrist, which means I look after people with mental health issues, and I want to invite you for a moment into my clinic, into my experience of the last 20 months, most of which has taken place within these four walls at home. This is where I've been doing my clinical work. And I just want to tell you a little story about something that happened in January of this year. We were deep into the the winter lockdown, which was so grim for so many of us. And I saw a client I hadn't seen for 2 years, and she was well when I last saw her, a young woman in work. And she zoomed into my clinic space and she was psychotic. She was really unwell. She was hearing voices, she was paranoid, she was anxious, she was in real distress. And I had to reach through the screen to her and try and keep her in the space and try and make her feel safe and work out what was going on. And really what was going on was the impact of social isolation. She was living in a shared flat with people she didn't get on with, and she felt really unsupported and very isolated. Now, we know that social isolation is profoundly bad for the human brain. If you look at studies from the Antarctic, where the European Space Agency studies social isolation in trainee astronauts, it shrinks the brain. After 5 months, there are measurable differences in brain size in people who've been kept in social isolation. And I know I had a session with John McCarthy, the he was in isolation he was held hostage for a long time. His vision changed through social isolation, through being held indoors for a long period of time. So we know that isolation has a profound impact, and we also know the pandemic has been super, super stressful. Gross national anxiety doubled. If you look at the Office for National Statistics surveys from April of last year, our anxiety went from around 3 to nearly 6, and it's not fully come back down again. So we were under extreme stress because the pandemic is new, it's unpredictable, there's a threat to the ego, and the sense of control is lost. And it's done that to us again and again and again. So throughout the pandemic, we're approaching novelty, we're dealing with uncertainty. It's new to be hybrid working. I deliver sessions on hybrid, I try and facilitate groups in a hybrid format. That's hard. And I feel uncertain. And my sense of control is gone. And then there's, vaccine uncertainty and where will we all be working? So this is being delivered in spades, this novelty, the uncertainty, the threat to the ego, and the lack of the sense of control. So there are new hits of stress for all of us all the time. Many of us are getting very tired. So on top of that kind of ongoing stress, and those 4 factors I call nuts, and those are evidence-based from research in California, on top of those 4 factors, the problem with working from home, from where I sit, which is at home, but the problem with working in isolation from home is that actually you're stripping out your well-being vitamins. As a well-being expert, I talk about always the well-being vitamins, which are small behavioral changes that make a big difference. And they're really small things like getting access to daylight first thing in the morning. That helps set your sleep cycle. It helps you to sleep properly at night. Walking is really, really good for the human brain. It's what we're designed to do. And if you're not getting 10,000 steps, then you're actually depleting your brain of an important experience daily. Not just your brain, also your muscles and your metabolism. So that's another well-being vitamin. Access to green space. We're an outdoor species. We evolved outdoors. We know that being around plant material just reduces our stress within a couple of minutes. And also, obviously, the social contact. So there's all these natural well-being vitamins. And for me, it felt like before the pandemic, there was a great buffet. Every day I could go to this buffet and I could choose what I had in my sandwich and I could choose what I had for dessert. Was I going to go to prep for lunch? Was I going to go out somewhere else? Who would I see? Who would I bump into? Which way would I walk home? Loads and loads of cognitive richness in my environment. And we switched to what I call the processed life, where my entire work comes through the screen. I'm not going to starve. I'm being fed some degree of stimulus, but it's processed. It's like you've taken away all the choice. You've taken away the richness. And we continue now to live a processed life it's a more processed life than it was, unless we're able to get back into that rich cognitive environment. So that's been my experience. And I think, Carlos, you've got some thoughts to add to that, haven't you?
I do, Judy. Thank you so much for the great introduction. And it really sets us up for the discussion of what we believe is the future of workplace and some of the research that we've done and some of the forecasting that we're doing. So the reality is it needs to be human-centric. It needs to address the well-being of the individuals now going into the workplace in this new hybrid environment. We have to be amenity rich. We've been doing amenities for quite a while now, but the reality is that this is where people congregate, this is where people collaborate, this is where people socialize and connect. The number one reason why people want to go back to the office is for those human connections that you described so well. It's also for building culture and community. It's really difficult to build culture and community via Zoom alone. And also the workspace in the future needs to become a magnet for learning. Some of our surveys and the folks that we asked for, they were missing quite a bit being mentored and being coached. Some of the learning was compromised by Zoom and by team meetings. I think that the scheduling of it can work, but there's a serendipity aspect that it's really, really important for all professional services firms. And then focus on the quality of work also becomes really important. I think that's also one of the #1 reasons why people say they're either joining a firm or leaving a firm is concerns around the actual quality of the work that they're doing and the people that they're doing it with, which speaks to the culture. So to that end, we're building a very layered approach to understanding hybrid work environment. So it's a little bit less about the types of spaces that we're designing, and it's a lot more about that experience. So mapping that experience, having a deep understanding of the people that are using the spaces, the personas as it were, is really, really critical. Not everybody works the same way. Not everybody reacts the same way to the space or needs the same space. So we've created this idea of doing an energy mapping of your actual physical space. And some spaces have elevated energy versus others, and we understand why that is. We try to match it to the personality of the user, whether that be a group of people, a department, or a particular type of person. I mean, believe it or not, we're now talking about the introverts and the extroverts in the workplace and how this pandemic has affected that. It's really come to the forefront. How does collective innovation happen in this space? We need to map that. Where does it happen? We're talking about soul spaces to address this well-being that you're mentioning. Layered biophilia. It's not just about plant materials and access to natural light, but it's the whole environment and what that really means to the individual. So we're testing ideas. I always say this, anybody who's telling you that they know the answer of what the workplace of future is lying to you, because we're all really unpacking it live and we're all figuring it out together. So testing ideas is our big recommendation. Most of our clients are very willing to do that. And they have an understanding that they have to be in beta mode, which means it's quick testing and the ability to pivot quickly. So we are designing pilot programs. We're building these pilot programs. We're learning from other sectors and adapting, whether that be the tech sector, whether that be the media, all other sectors that are perhaps a little bit ahead of the game in terms of the ways they work. We can learn from them. We also have an understanding that not one size fits all. Every firm has a different perspective and a different culture. So the solution needs to be also bespoke. Anybody offering one size fits all solutions, I think is also not addressing your personal culture. And so we conclude with an idea that the hybrid work style and the physical space needs to grow with your firm's culture, needs to adapt to that, needs to foster that community, and needs to support also your business model at the end of the day. So those are the things that we're focusing at the moment. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Paul.
Thank you, Carlos, and good morning all, and I hope you are all well. So following the context that Judith and Carlos has set out, what I thought I would do is just share actually what the BDO story was, because I think one of the massive challenges in the situation that we're dealing with is that there's so much complexity, there's so much thinking, so many moving parts, but in the meantime, as business leaders, we have to make some very, very clear and often difficult decisions dealing with a huge number of dilemmas. So let me just run you through what we did at BDO. And by the way, I'm not saying that we've got it right. All I'm telling you is what we did. Now, so pre-pandemic, we were 6,000 people operating in 18 offices in the UK. So I'm just talking about the UK firm. Although having said that, our experience does map incredibly close to literally every other BDO country I've spoken to. And as Anna says, we're in over 160 countries. So 6,000 people, 18 offices pre-pandemic, 90% of those people pretty much worked 100% of their time office-based. And I'd say a very high percentage of those were pretty straightforward within classic office hours of 9 till 5. And all of our surveys pre-pandemic were very positive in terms of our people proposition, our office facilities, flexibility. There didn't seem to be any huge demand for us to change the way that we operated. Indeed, it felt as if we were in the groove. And then, of course, our world, just as your world and everybody else's world, came to a screeching halt in March 2020. And we had to find a way of effectively guillotining the old world. And we moved 100% to people working remotely, with all of the challenges that we've all experienced around rolling out IT for 6,000 people, and a huge focus on people's well-being. Yeah, focus, well-being and safety. And everything about our thinking about the future was just put on hold whilst we were dealing with that immediate crisis and trying to process everything that was going on. So then, as we worked our way through 2020, we turned our attention to all of the articles by learned people, and we also found out that our own human analysis of what was going on was strangely mapping all of the fantastic stuff that was coming out from Harvard and Oxford and these other institutions. So as a leadership team, we sat down and we wanted to make sure that we undertook some very slow thinking about how we were going to work through the balance of the pandemic and how we were then going to start to plan for a post-pandemic world. And how did we do that? We did all of the obvious stuff. We did our people surveys. But one of the things I found personally really, really helpful was that we did a number of listening events. A listening event for us is a group of 15 people. I sit in and we just have an hour or so of actually listening. And we did that through 4 lenses. We did it through gender. So we had 6 gender listening events where our female colleagues told us what they were experiencing and what they thought that we should be building into our future thinking. We did it through some senior team, some directors and principals that have been in the profession for maybe 20, 25 years. We did it through our early in careers people. We've got about 1,800 people. That was quite emotional, hearing young people tell you how their expectations of the world of work had just been completely smashed up and what it felt like. It was, and being a parent with 3 children going through that. And we also did it through the lens of BAME to see if there were other elements from our BAME members of staff. So taking all of that into account, and I could always share some of that data if it helps, but we did a number of things. First of all, we absolutely believe that there is a role for physical office space in the future of our 100% on that. So we've got no plans to significantly reduce, but we do appreciate that we will use office space differently. We then made what I think was a very big call back in September 2020. Do you remember September 2020? Things were pretty scary. You come out of the summer, which was okay, and we were clearly going into another deep lockdown. But we made the decision to invest in further fit out of our offices. Now, our offices pre-pandemic were very smart, very well located. But we decided to spend another £8 million, taking into account some of the things that Carlos was mentioning about people's expectations, the environment, the different space, the technology fit out, the ease of use, flexible, all of the booking systems and all of that, on the fundamental principle that if people are going to return to work and make that choice on a daily basis, do you roll over and say it's easier for me not to go in, or do you roll over and say, do you know what, I think I'm going to be excited and energized by going in, and I can't quite put my finger on it. It might be the coffee, it might be the comfy chair, or it might just be the imagery, but or that nourishment that Judith mentioned of other people smiling and engaging. That was a big bet. And interestingly, that was before inflation kicked in. So I think, strangely enough, we've got a good deal, because I think the prices have gone up, by the way. The other thing that we made a fundamental decision on was to offer hybrid working. I'm going to play the classic accountant here. Actually, I'm a very people-orientated person, but I'll give you some numerical thinking, which is I truly do not think that there is an algorithm, and if you don't believe me, look up theory around traveling salesmen, that could give any organization a perfect sort of set of barcodes for each employee to tell them when, how, and when they would turn up. So we are backing our people to intelligently feel their way through this with some framework and some support, particularly on well-being and making sure that we don't miss people out. So we have what we call a hybrid policy. We call it workable. So again, giving it a name which people recognize that things have changed. And it effectively gives every single individual personal choice, but personal choice as to where they work and how they work by reference to their own personal preferences, the team dynamics, the client dynamics, and of course the overall philosophy of the firm, which is a complex equation. And we're not, as Carlos mentioned, we're definitely in beta mode. We've got all of the software, and from time to time we will pause and evaluate. And I'll finish with a little bit of numbers before I hand over to Matt. So pre-pandemic, 6,000 people, our people were spending 3 million people hours a year on commuting. They were then spending another 1 million people hours a year on in-work commuting, taxis and the rest of it. So that's 4 million people hours. Pandemic comes along and it gets guillotined, it goes down to 0. Our expectation is that that will creep up to maybe 1.5 million travel hours, but they will be much, much smarter hours, individual choice, synchronization with teams. On that note, I'll hand over to Matt that will take us up a level to help us understand what the world of property looks like. Matt.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm so glad you used the word choice, because that was literally what I was going to start on. Lockdown, we all agree, was freakish, unpleasant, because we were having something imposed upon us. We're now firmly in the world of choice. And I think, we've been talking in the sort of the office industry about flexibility and choice for a very long time. And I think we all knew that giving employees more flexibility and more choice was the right thing to do. But we perhaps didn't do it. So how is empowering people to make choices washing through the world? If you look at, we collect data across about 220,000 employees across the UK on a weekly basis, seeing whether they're going into the office. The week before last, 20% was the average in UK office buildings, so 20% occupancy. Now, they were never at 100%, but that is still a long way from normal. You might say, well, people are still cautious about, getting on public transport, rubbing shoulders, etc. In the same week, admittedly on the Saturday of that week, Piccadilly Circus was back to normal levels of footfall. So office dramatically down, going out, socializing, shopping, eating and drinking, absolutely back to normal. So I think there is a clear message here about the choices that are people making. Yes, they want social interaction, and they are getting that outside working hours. They are clearly not wanting to go into the office. Now, there are lots of interesting geographical differences here. Literally just received this morning our pan-European equivalent data. And actually, if you look outside the UK, apart from Germany, which has fallen off in the last week or two for very obvious reasons, we're almost back to normality. Typically, mainland European office workers are spending about 1.4 days a week at home. The average before the crisis was 1.1. So there's something different between the British psyche and the European psyche, and whether that is personal psyche or corporate psyches is questionable. Asia Pac, we have been back, other than in the countries where there are sort of, lockdowns in place, to pretty much normal levels of occupancy in the office markets across most of Asia Pac, particularly in the most populous cities. But actually in sort of US and UK, very different story. The most popular cities, the most public transport dependent cities, have been the slowest to return to work. So Manhattan is really mapping London, actually slightly worse than London in terms of office occupancy. I think this has got a lot to do with mass transit. I think it's got a lot to do with corporate ethos. It's got a lot to do with businesses' concerns about being sued by staff if they apply pressure to them to return to work. But I think, you know, people have been empowered to make a choice, and that is a good thing. What is not a good thing, because seeing as the title of this event is People and Property, is what it means for my day job, which is property. You know, what we're seeing in the property markets in the US and the UK, or the office property markets, is an almost complete inability for the heads of real estate and the CEOs to make a decision. You do not know whether you need 50,000, 100,000 or 150,000 square feet at the moment, because that 20% could and probably will rise over the next 9 months. Will it get back to 60, 65%, which was the norm before the crisis in the UK? I don't think it will. But you don't want to be the head of real estate who goes to someone like Paul and says, I'm really sorry I acquired a building that was too small for you, or I acquired a building that was too large. So what we're seeing in the market is very high levels of demand. The amount of space that's under offer in London is above normal levels. The amount of requirements are above normal levels. But if you can delay making that decision for a little bit longer, you are. So really bad news for office developers and landlords. But I think, you know, finishing on a positive point, it's changing corporate behavior. And I think, you know, while we are seeing companies downsizing as a result of this, just saying, look, we do not need as much space as we thought we needed, despite the fact that we're planning on growing. And that's been the big change over the last 9 months, is businesses going from headcount cuts to headcount growth. But even if we're downsizing, we're going to take better space. And that money that we are saving by taking 20% less space is being spent on better space. Nobody really takes a worse office building when they move, because we all know that a good environment improves productivity and happiness and wellness, etc. These are all things we've been talking about for, you know, a decade. So better buildings, you know, are more sought after. And then you tie in the environmental debate as well, the surge in corporate and staff interest in, you know, is it green? This is also driving a bias in the markets towards prime. So if you look at the London office market this year, nearly 90% of all the space taken has been of grade A quality, the highest ever level. So I think, you know, we're going to be delivering better environments for our employees. I still have a very, very significant question in the back of our mind as to whether our employees are going to utilize those environments. It's not that people hate the office. Every survey we've ever done in pretty much any Western city, whether it's for individual companies or across the market, says the single thing that employees consider as the most important thing about their office is, does it minimize my commute? And I think what we're really seeing at the moment is staff have been empowered to take the thing they hate most out of their working life, which is the commute. And that means I don't think things are going to change dramatically. And I think it was going to be a very brave, I have 2 or 3 clients where the CEO has said to the staff, you must be back in the office X days a week, with varying degrees of success. I think, you know, being in a very hot jobs market and forcing people back is going to be a problem. But I don't think people have a problem with the working environment. I think, you know, the work of Carlos and everyone else in the design sector, you know, we've long known that, you know, better places make people happier and more productive. And once people get there, that's great. It's the getting there that's the problem.
Very much, Matt. Well, certainly a lot of different views across the table, all connecting very nicely with a number of different themes. So choice keeps coming up with everybody, actually. So Judith, if I can just turn to you first of all, you talked about the population suffering from significant levels of stress brought on by uncertainty. You also talked about the benefit of having choices, but there's a question when you've got choices that there's also a lot of uncertainty that comes with that. Don't know which choice to make, what's right for me, etc. So what sort of advice could you offer people around that balancing of leaders of practices saying, look, here's choice, which we've heard there's a lot of in the UK, perhaps compared to other destinations, compared to this sort of level of uncertainty that you're talking about? How can we help people reduce that stress levels?
Thank you, Anna. That's such a great question. And also, Matt, I really loved your point about the US and the UK not going back to the office, because I think that perhaps speaks, and I may be speaking out of turn, but I wonder if it speaks to a more individualistic culture, that we are happy to go our own way. And that, I think, is key to this idea of autonomy, of choice. We know autonomy is key to employee satisfaction. And I think what we're really experiencing in businesses is this tension between individuals and the organization. So it might be right for an organization to have everybody in the office bums on seats, or it might not, but that certainly isn't going to be right for all of those individuals, because humans are so diverse, and what's right for one person is very different for the next. So I think it's probably being comfortable with bumpiness as leaders. So I think, the pandemic has taught us that expect the unexpected, and it's difficult feeling out of control. It's stressful, but we just maybe need to get used to kind of slightly more of a sense of psychological bumpiness, that we don't know the answer, that it is an evolving situation, and that we won't know until 9, 12, 18 months in whether we're getting it right, because our employees are very diverse people and have very different needs. Hope that answers the question, I think.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is, look, we've got to go with this and then live with the uncertainty ourselves, but listen to people along the way. And Paul, you talked a bit about the listening events that you did at BDO. And have you pivoted at all in terms of how you've been thinking as we've been going through sort of this social experiment that I've talked about?
Yeah, look, so the things I would add in my response to that is pre-pandemic, I used to do a lot of, well, I still do a huge amount of reading, but if you ever wanted to read a book, anyone, read any of the Black Swan events, Fooled by Randomness or The Drunkard's Walk. And actually, it confirms exactly what Judith has said, actually, which is this phenomena of uncertainty and stress is not new, but humans have kind of had their way because they've been able to march through, leading primarily on quantitative data as opposed to qualitative data, and humans, we're useless at interpreting qualitative data, aren't we? So in short, I think money and has really led the way. And independent of the pandemic, actually, I think we would have faced this issue because of the rise of ESG. If you just get closer and closer to ESG, these questions about how humans will think about leading their own lives is going to become more complex, because it's easy to join the debate on ESG, and then it's very difficult to then observe yourself and realize that you're part of the issue. So all of this stuff is coming together, and the pandemic has created this massive shock and as Matt says, forced us into experiencing something that we clearly didn't like. So I'm constantly pivoting. I'm trying to absorb as much qualitative and quantitative data as I can, but then I've really trained my brain on one fundamental point, which is, if I'd asked myself or anybody pre-pandemic what the world of work would have looked like, I would have, pre-pandemic, I was wrong. So the chances are, whatever I think it is now, I'm still wrong. But in the meantime, I'm responsible for running a business, and I've got to make some sensible decisions and help us keep on edging forward and learn. And I think the qualitative data that will come from our people will help us shape and create a tipping point in things that work and they will clearly reject what they don't like. They really will. And as Matt says, the employment market has made beautiful conditions for that, hasn't it? Because if they don't like it, they're going to go. So it's really harsh.
Yeah, and of course there is a huge movement of people around as well. So, you know, which might be being driven by different factors. So Carlos, this point that I think you picked up in your brief introduction as well was this point around pivoting and being able to sort of try things out, test things out, and take an alternative route. As Paul says, things are developing. How do you do that with a property, which is a big investment? As Matt was saying, you know, people are trying to hold off on those decisions, but at some stage people do make those decisions. BDO's made that big decision, lots of investment. So in reality, how are people actually going about?
Yeah, great question, Anna. And I think that some of this piloting of ideas may also be around the strategy for your real estate portfolio. It's not just for the individual office or the individual space. I think the commute issue that Matt described is very relevant, absolutely. So to that end, a lot of companies are now considering very seriously the hub and spoke model, right? Where you do have a hub office in the center of the city that is all about building that culture and those events and those magnets that make me want to go to the office. Really very compelling, something I don't get on a Saturday in Piccadilly Circus, something I don't get in my living room. And so then for the easier commute, perhaps you do satellite offices. A lot of financial organizations are using things that are underutilized, you know, for example, retail banking, that are being converted into WeWork type spaces, collaboration type spaces that ameliorate that sort of pain of the commute. But for example, as we move forward with the acceptance of hybrid, because everybody is in that acceptance, unassigned seating is become paramount, because if you stay, for example, with the notion that everybody gets their own desk, everybody gets their own office, they're only going to go to the office 2 to 3 days a week. Very not sustainable to have an office of however many square feet you're contemplating, whether it's 100,000 square feet or 50,000 or 300,000, that sits empty for half of the week. That's just not very smart solution. So folks that are not used to that, and there are a lot of folks that are not used to that, need to test those ideas. What happens when you go to unassigned? You have to offer a very different kit of parts. So building those in right now, I think is a very good time to do that, because the office is half empty, and Matt will tell you only 20% of the people are showing up. So maybe selecting a quarter of a floor or half a floor to test some of these ideas and put it in practice for a number of months, say 6 months, will set us up for the future in a better way.
Yeah, and anybody else want to follow up on that point?
Well, I was going to actually ask Carlos and Matt maybe a question, which is another thing that stuck out in my mind as we're wrestling this is for the year 22 will be the first year that BDO spends more money on IT than it does on property. Historically, we've always spent more on property. So we spend about 40 million a year on property, and we're going to be spending more than that on IT. And when Matt was saying the equation of how do you think about the financial equation of property, we're now starting to think of that as a single equation, which is the property and the technology have to work together. And there seems to be so many opportunities to do that. And I wonder whether you're seeing that, Carlos or Matt, and then maybe Judith, do you see that there's dangerous sides of technology?
Yeah, no, I will answer that really quickly, because in the hybrid world, having that equity, you cannot have the employees that chose not to come to the office be penalized and they feel left out. So everybody is seeking that sort of equity for everyone else. And a lot of firms are investing in more technology. More technology is being developed. Google is working very hard at developing new technology that makes it feel like everybody is cohesively in the same room. So we have to be very receptive to all the new things that are coming in and being able to adopt them. This will continue to evolve for the next year, Paul, as you know, and tech companies work very fast.
Yep, Matt, did you want to comment?
Yeah, again, I probably shouldn't say this as a property person, but I don't think property is that important. Ultimately, offices are just a box to keep the rain off your staff. I get very excited about it. But it's a telling. We did a piece of work some years ago looking at just sort of FTSE and Dow Jones companies, and off the top of my head, roughly 80% of those companies, the head of HR was on the board. In less than 20%, the head of real estate was. And I think that's about right. And you see this in costs, typically for an organization, 10, 15% of their total cost is real estate. And yes, IT undeniably, answering Paul's question, is come up and indeed above that. But staff are the biggest cost. So why try and save money on a relatively small portion of your cost base at the expense of the big bit? And hot desking, universally hated, always has been. Corporate real estate executives, they're funny people. They only have one KPI, which is, did I reduce the rent bill or did I increase it? And that's how their performance is measured. And it's absolutely illogical. And everything that we were struggling with before the crisis, all our surveys showed heightened stress levels in workplaces about noise. Smell suddenly started to rise up as a stress level because we were driving occupational densities higher and higher and higher. We brought in hot desking. People couldn't create their little home away from home. And we thought before the crisis that was all about to change. Staff were going to give them more space and people were going to drop hot desking. I'm afraid one of the things we're seeing at the moment is people, to Carlos's point, a lot of companies are going exactly that. Well, you're not in, so you can't have a desk. And I think, we've got to remember that one of perhaps the positives for some people when they were working at home is they created their own perfect little workspace. They got the light level right, they got the air level right, they had the screen in the right position. They've come back to the office where all these things are being imposed upon them, and you can have as many forums as you want, but someone is going to be upset, and and removing the things that upset people is a huge factor. So I worry slightly that all our surveys are showing is that companies are imposing more hot desking on their staff, and that just I don't think is a good thing. It's the wrong equation. People want more space, more comfort, so let's not give it to them.
Okay, well, Judith, I think you might be up for this one. So what's your response to that?
Well, it's really interesting hearing you talking about property and technology and then obviously people, because people is the big cost. And what we're really talking about here is how do we get property and technology to interact with people so they perform better, so that their productivity goes up. And that's such a complicated equation. But I do think where property comes in handy is it is the marketplace. It is the place we come together. And yes, we can do that now using tech in a virtual way, but it is different. And to go back to another story, I realized that I was going to need a physical office when I saw somebody face to face for the first time after a year. And I realized why we hadn't made any progress in therapy. It's because she was having an affair. She couldn't tell me about her affair when we were doing it over with her at home. Yeah. So there are very human reasons why we do need to be in different environments. And I think it's about saying maybe the office of the future just looks very different. I'm amazed at how often I'm now invited into offices to be part of the offering to people, psychologists, psychiatrists, sports therapists, the whole piece around how do we keep our human capital performing the way it needs to. And I'm going to speak up for the commute. I'm the only person here who will speak up for the commute. The commute does something useful to the human brain, which is when we're not doing anything in particular, we switch on our default mode network. If you're interested in this, you can read the book, The Art of Rest. There's many, many things we do when we are awake, but not really doing anything productive. And we are using our default mode network to reflect and strategize. And the commute does that, even though we all hate it. So
yeah, and probably a good time to introduce the word culture into all of this and what we're all trying to achieve as businesses. And so, Paul, there's actually a question from our audience as well linked to this, which is around how successful all of our work has been around the redesign, and is it really being used in the way that you thought it had been? Is there, what are the consequences? And maybe you can wrap that up with the point around culture as well.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Ira. Hope you're well as well. So we, a few headlines to help you understand our journey. So yes, we committed to the refurb. Prior to the refurb, we were experiencing a tiny number of people choosing to attend the offices. As we opened each of the floors, the excitement definitely grew, and through Yammer and all of the rest of it, photos and videos were shared, and it did create a tipping point. But like so many things in life, I don't know whether that was just like a sugar rush. It was something different. It gave us a distraction, but those numbers are creeping up time and time again. In terms of the hot desking, it was definitely the strongest feedback was, I do not want to, they didn't use this, but I do. I don't want to be on a Ryanair flight where I turn up and want to sit next to 5 of my friends and you intentionally, or your software intentionally fragments me across all parts of the building. So we've worked really hard to find some software where you have friendship groups and circles, and you will definitely be allocated desks on the day, but within your groups, and that seems to be working really well. And we can flex, we're using the culture and the human network of the building to rewire that software as we learn. And so we are probably up to about each day maybe 15-20% of occupancy, but it's a very different 20% each day. So it's probably 60-65% of people are now coming in, and so far it's working really well. But I'm always worried that it's a bit of a sugar rush and we all just then get bored.
And those occupancy rates, interesting that I think Matt was talking about the space that people have and we all perhaps being squeezed. But at BDO, my experience is that people have got a lot more space to move around in and use differently. And Carlos, is this the sort of nature of that you're seeing from your clients as well, the sort of the greater level of space of professional services firms in particular, increasing the environment?
I think, well, Matt's right when he says that people aren't necessarily reducing space. And this isn't about reducing space, it's about building different types of spaces, right? I mean, I actually want to defend free addressing. I don't like the term hot desking. It's gotten such a bad connotation. It's like a hot potato, like nobody wants it. The reality is that it can work, but it needs to be managed, just like anything in life, I suppose. You have to offer the proper kit of parts. If you don't have the proper kit of parts, it doesn't work. This notion that you have a sea of open desks and you're just going to be hot desking on those sounds awful. That's not what anybody's really advocating. I think you need to depart from the premise that you're going to be working in very different modes all day long. Sometimes you focus, sometimes you collaborate, sometimes you're learning. It's about doing different types of work. You're supposed to be somewhat ambulatory throughout your office. Sometimes you're not even in the office. So that has to be factored in. Our research also suggests that, believe it or not, open plan and readdressing creates more innovation, right? The levels of innovation rise. And so if those points are tackled, it can be successful, but it's about working differently and providing for the different types of spaces. And that elbow room is absolutely right. You do need that in order to make all of this work. I mean, I do believe that not just the young generations, a lot of people, a lot of clients are coming to us and saying, make me net zero by 2030. I mean, the first thing I say is, well, with 300,000 square foot and half of it is going to sit empty, that doesn't sound very sustainable to me. We gotta consider that. I think that's really an important aspect, the sustainability, the wasteful nature of having an office that is just going to sit empty all the time. So to that end, I think designing the types of spaces that they're really more work points that support the different styles becomes really important.
Oh, you've been so polite. Put your hand up.
No, I was just going to amplify Carlos's point by just sharing again with the audience. So pre-pandemic in our Baker Street office, which is a huge office, it's a couple of 100,000 square feet. I think we roughly had pre our fit out 1,800 desks that you would recognize as desks with computers and screens, and the rest was already rooms, breakout areas, and all of the sort of felt furniture, which is lovely. And it was quite a shock to us when the first version of the plans we saw took that 1,800 desks down to 1,200. So we all went, what, less desks? And the answer is yes, because very, very different areas, space, breakout, private Zoom areas. So we're now using less desks, and people are using the space they're learning to use that space differently.
Yeah. And then I want to add what Paul mentioned is really important. The idea of not free addressing throughout the entire building, that sounds horrible as well. We do create neighborhoods. Yeah. So you share within the neighborhood. So a department, a group, so they always kind of know where they're going. Also, we are inventing new technologies to create more adjustability, from lighting levels to the temperature of the light to sit stand. So to Matt's point, people are looking for comfort and ergonomics, and it's not a one size fits all. And the technology around that continues to evolve. Temperature, all of it.
Yeah. And Matt, just talking about that ability for property to be a higher quality. So are you seeing the demand go up for the higher quality offices, or, you know, is there something that our audience should be thinking about if they've got those sort of decision points to come up?
Yes. You know, there is no doubt that the majority of demand is now for higher quality, and the vast majority, and that is, you know, that's driven by staff, that's driven by not necessarily trying to hit net zero, but at least have a building that is more sustainable and lower energy bills. Luckily, you know, if I suspect most of BDO's client base is based in, you know, the major cities around the world, the supply side is moving to respond to that. And you read any listed REITs results at the moment, and that they're planning on building to deliver the right type of space. But you know, there is going to be pressure on rents. And I think, you know, some companies will perhaps be forced to take a bit less to able to afford a bit more, and they'll be forced to spend a bit more on their architects and their designers to make sure they've got the right space. But again, I keep on coming back to this point. It's only 15% of your total cost base. You know, it astonishes me when, you know, major corporates are getting stuck on a deal for, you know, a couple of pounds a square foot. It really shouldn't matter. You know, the building is, you know, it's just a side, you know, it is a big number, but you probably wouldn't spend as much time negotiating the price of the lease of your photocopiers across your estate. So I think, you know, let's be a little bit more realistic about what the point of property is. And the point of property really is just about, you know, is about people. And if you have to spend a bit more to make the people a bit less unhappy, do it.
I know, Paul, you've got your hand up.
No, I was just going to, but when it's a really interesting point that Matt mentioned last time we spoke, which is, Matt, I think last time we spoke, you mentioned basically how privileged the professional services firms and sector is in terms of the quality of space we do occupy. And you gave us some stats about how bad and I just think it's quite a profound point. It's worth sharing.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, we, you know, most of us on this call dwell in a very luxurious world. You know, we work for big companies, we run big companies, they have big budgets, they take nice buildings, they employ great architects, they have HR teams, they can bring in people like Julie to think about the health and wellness of their staff. But, you know, probably in the UK, you know, 70-something% of companies are SMEs. You know, when you're relatively young in your corporate growth, you can't afford to spend this money. Most companies are in fairly, to be brutally blunt, crap offices. Does it affect that company's ability to do business? No, it doesn't. Actually, you know, many of them happily grow into big, rich companies. But you know, we are bad as an industry about thinking about the people who can't afford the best of the best of the best. And I think, you know, this is why this debate is so important, because we need to think about how do we take this data and this learnings and spread it to people who can't afford it. And, you know, I would say this as a researcher, but, you know, whether I'm talking about environmental sustainability or the workplace, you know, we've got to get better about sharing data. Because, you know, Paul, you know, you've got great data that, you know, some of your smaller clients, you know, they couldn't even afford to commission the work that you've done. And, you know, the more we share data on our successes, and I think, you know, most importantly, our failures, because, you know, you can afford to make a mistake. You can afford, as Carlos says, test things. You know, if you're only in 100, 200 square feet, you can't afford to test work styles. So let's be a bit more open about sharing these things with everyone. And I think, you know, there are a lot of trade organizations that we can do it through.
Pretty well said, Matt, thank you. And actually this sort of got a couple more minutes left. So Judith, I just want to come back to you and see if there's anything in particular that you want to leave the audience with. So Matt was very much bigging up, you know, we're lucky. Look, we're in the middle of a lot of change and it's difficult for leaders, absolutely. But we're in a very privileged position. So is there anything that you wanted to comment on before I close the call?
I guess I would invite us all to celebrate how we've made progress in the last 20 months. Nobody would have thought we would be now doing what we're doing. And we don't take enough time to say, gosh, that was really hard. We've done really well to get to this point. Humans are unbelievably adaptable. We've lived in cities and in social groups throughout our evolution, and we will continue to do that. So to be part of a discussion that's about the evolution of the office is really exciting. And I guess just to take that away, that positive celebration.
Absolutely,
we've come so far.
So thank you. And look, there has been so much that's discussed on this call, and I'm sure we've given everybody in the audience a lot of food to be thinking about. And the social experiment absolutely continues. And you know, if we go from, at least I think what I'm hearing is that the offices are not going to go the same way as the high streets, in the sense of, you know, they're going to disappear, which I thought maybe at some stage Matt might be suggesting. But, you know, that sense of community and the culture that we get when we come together is so key to our people. And of course, then we haven't even started to discuss the impact on our clients. So plenty more to continue to discuss. And I just want to say thank you very much for our panelists for sharing very openly your views and experiences today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day, everybody.